The first season of House of the Dragon has been out for a while now, and we've all had some time to sit with it. There are aspects I really enjoyed about it, and a couple things that I didn't. While it's certainly not a bad show, I don't think it's a controversial opinion to have when I say that it doesn't quite live up to the standards set by its parent. But I thought I might have a biased view since Game of Thrones has the advantage of being a 6-season show. Yes, I said only 6. So I decided to give the first season of each show a rewatch and judge them using only what's given in that season. This also worked out pretty well since I didn't really remember too much about the first few seasons of Game of Thrones. And I won't keep you in suspense. Between these 2 season ones, Game of Thrones is better, and there's a few reasons why. The first of which being that the protagonists in Game of Thrones are just more likable. Something I found shocking as I was rewatching is that Ned Stark is only in 9 of the 73 episodes of Game of Thrones. That comes out to about 12% of the show's runtime, and he has such a looming presence over the series that when I think of Game of Thrones, he's still one of the first characters I picture. It's really impressive what they did with Ned, because he's a character that could easily have been incredibly boring. So many stories try to write someone that is way too perfect, and it kills any potential they had to be interesting. But the show gets around this problem in a couple ways with Ned. Early on, they tell you that Ned did once cheat on his wife and that he's deeply ashamed of it, and they show how hurt Jon Snow is that he never warned him about what the Night's Watch really was. Later in the show, they reveal that both of these things are just him protecting Jon from the king. But as of the first season, this makes him appear flawed in interesting ways. Ned Stark is easily the most righteous character on the show, but they use that to show how big of a deal it is when he does betray his honor. When he first answers the call to become Hand of the King, Catelyn accuses him of valuing his honor more than he does the welfare of his family. And this is what really makes him remain interesting despite being such a almost perfect person. Because they've taken 2 positive things about him, how much he cares about his family and how much honor he has, and put them at odds with each other. And it gives him a really interesting dilemma at the end of the season when he's talking to Varys in the dungeons. I mean, he's being labeled as a traitor for being the only person willing to try to stop the Lannisters from stealing the throne. And he's essentially given a choice of betraying his honor and having his reputation ruined so that he can live for the sake of his family. He finds it in himself to give up this one selfish thing he holds on to, which is his reputation as a man of honor, out of love for his family, and once he does, he's killed anyway, and it was all for nothing. That is just heartbreaking, and that's why his story is so memorable. Uncle Ned was killed that night for being the only person who did the right thing. Another character done really well here is Tyrion. He's witty and rude, but clearly has a good heart and cares enough about people to help a crippled Bran learn to ride a horse, learn the stories of men of the Night's Watch, and try to tell Jon Snow what he's getting into by going to the Wall. Dany's also really easy to empathize with, and you're immediately rooting for her to gain some control over her life after being treated like property the entire season. Arya is naive and hot-headed, but isn't afraid to stand up for what's right, and has a youthful, adventurous free spirit. Jon Snow is immature and prideful, but also protects Sam from his bullies, in a scene that accurately represents how it makes me feel when you guys don't subscribe to the channel. Anyway, this does make him very unpopular, and shows that even though he's ambitious and hot-headed, he takes after his father and chooses to do what's right instead of what's easy. He also has a decent arc in the season of learning what it means to keep an oath, despite how many problems tempt him to break it. The way they wrote King Robert is also really well done. By all rights, you should hate this guy. He's a terrible king that is constantly drunk and ruining the country, but he's still just so likable. He respects Ned and understands that everyone around him just wants power. Though he's honestly a pretty bad guy, he's so sad and funny at the same time that it's hard to dislike him. He never really wanted to be king, he just wanted to take the kingdom. And he spends all his time reminiscing about his glory days with Ned. House of the Dragon, however, doesn't have many likable characters. Wait a minute, don't hurt me. That's not to say the characters aren't complex or interesting. They are well written, and not every character needs to be someone you root for in order to have their place in the story. The problem I see, though, is that almost none of the main characters are good people. There are a couple exceptions to this, though. The first few episodes of the show, I didn't like King Viserys because of what he put his wife through by being so obsessed with having a son, and because he's just not a very good king. He's way too passive. As the season went on, though, they put a lot of work towards making him more endearing. His terrible medical condition makes us feel bad for him. Him and Rhaenyra have a great dynamic as father and daughter, and seeing them work out their differences is really interesting. And his final episode on the show is good enough to be compared to the best that Game of Thrones has to offer. He's a man that struggles to connect with his daughter and his brother, but no matter how frayed his relationship gets with either, he always attempts to initiate a reconciliation. Nothing is more important to him than family. Lionel Strong is also a really good person, and Rhaenys never does anything particularly bad, but they aren't very important to the story. Also, if I mispronounce any names from House of the Dragon, I'm not even sorry. I mean, have you seen these names? The main focus of the season is clearly on Rhaenyra, Damien, and Alicent, none of which really deserve to get what they want. Rhaenyra isn't fit to be queen. Over the course of the show, she lies to her best friend on her mother's grave, tries to get out of every duty she has, and allows herself to get pregnant 3 times with illegitimate children that put her, her children, her husband, and her lover at risk of being murdered. She and Damien also burn an innocent man alive just to fake her husband's death and improve her political standing. And when she is petitioning for her illegitimate son to become the heir of Driftwood, I feel like she's mostly in the wrong. I mean, she is stealing Driftwood from the real Valyrian bloodline and ending their family by doing so. Damien also does a lot of really horrible things, such as killing his wife, purposely humiliating Rhaenyra in order to make the king marry them together, and brutally leading the City Watch against the citizens of King's Landing. And do I even need to say why Alicent is the worst? Her and Otto purposely keep Viserys drugged so they can rule the kingdom. She has the Strongs killed, stabs Rhaenyra, and is a terrible mother. Oh, and she also shows a blade at Rhaenyra's wedding, which is actually done to signify that she's a bitch. I'm just messing around. But on a real note, she's certainly not likable. But you do kind of feel bad for her because you can see that her father has been forcing her to embrace her worst tendencies since she was a kid in order to achieve his own selfish goals. Still, I didn't find myself rooting for any of the characters to succeed in this show. That's not to say they aren't well developed. They're all really fleshed out and you can clearly see why they are the way they are, but I don't think any of them really serve well as the protagonists of the series. I do find the relationships between them interesting, especially between Alicent and Rhaenyra, but I don't really care who wins in the end, other than wanting to see the Hightowers fail a little more than I do the other Targaryens. I understand that the idea is that no one is completely in the right, and that the premise of the show is about the family causing its own downfall, but the lack of morality within the family does make me personally less invested in the story. The second big thing that keeps it from matching Game of Thrones is that the pacing is kind of erratic in House of the Dragon. The time jumps make it a bit jarring to follow, and it feels like you have to spend a lot of time just trying to catch up to what happened in between episodes. By the time you finish the season, it definitely feels like the first few episodes didn't need to start so far in the past. I mean, the way this season is structured is like if the first 2 episodes of Game of Thrones was a backstory episode of Robert's Rebellion to flesh out that him and Ned had friendship, and a whole episode or 2 showing Ned and his wife starting their family. And don't get me wrong, I would love to see a show about Robert's Rebellion nowadays, but that wouldn't have been relevant enough to the story of Game of Thrones to spend the first few episodes on it. I think I really would have preferred if the episodes taken up establishing the relationship between Viserys and Rhaenyra, and between Rhaenyra and Alicent, had been used to flesh out the personalities of their children instead. I think just looking at the first episode of Game of Thrones, you can see how much more efficient it is at establishing its world and characters. I mean, the very first scene is the reveal of the White Walkers, which already piques your interest and makes you want to know more about them. Then you're introduced to Ned Stark, and immediately see what he's all about when he executes the deserter from the Night's Watch. He makes Bran watch, and you see that Ned has a code of honor by the way he teaches him that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, a way of saying a ruler should never task others to do something he would not do himself. You can see just from the interactions between the 2 families that the Starks and the Lannisters hate each other, and the dialogue between Robert and Ned establishes they're old friends and that Robert respects and trusts him more than anyone else. You see that Ned and Catelyn don't want anything to do with the politics of King's Landing and understand that the Iron Throne is a big source of trouble they need to stay away from. And Jon Snow and Tyrion get interesting dialogue that sets up their stories for the season. This is all done while also showing Daenerys' side of the story, and that she's stuck on the other side of the world because of the rebellion that Robert led with Ned. And then the episode ends with the reveal that Jaime and Cersei are together, and Bran getting pushed out the window. They managed to pack so much information into this one episode while keeping you wanting to know more. And I think House of the Dragon would have benefited a lot from a similar approach with a bit of a faster pace. Another thing that helps the pace of Game of Thrones is that there are so many storylines that you never get bored when one of them slows down. If you're getting tired of the King's Landing politics, don't worry, because it's going to cut to what's happening with Tyrion and the Vale in a couple minutes. Jon Snow and Daenerys have what I would consider the slower storylines for this season, but I stayed interested in them the whole time because they never overstay their welcome, and the show is able to let us check in on them and feel like time is passing without the awkward fast forwards that House of the Dragon has, even if they don't have anything significant going on. Unfortunately, the first half of the season for House of the Dragon just doesn't have that many characters that it needs to flesh out, and since they're all part of the same family and mostly in the same location, there just isn't a lot of variety to keep things as interesting. I don't think we really needed a whole episode of suitors pursuing Rhaenyra to see that she didn't want to get married, though I do appreciate the symbolism of the white stag appearing for her, and Viserys struggling to kill his animal, showing he's losing control in that episode. I don't think we needed an episode mostly about Viserys deciding to marry Alicent instead of the Valyrian girl either. Again, I'm not saying these episodes are bad. I actually really like the way they developed the relationship between Damien, Viserys, Rhaenyra, and Alicent. I'm just saying I think the time could have been used more efficiently so they could flesh out Rhaenyra and Alicent's children before the war breaks out between them. There are also a couple plot points that I feel are done kind of badly. The first one is the way that Damien defeats the Crab Feeder. I really like the Crab Feeder as a villain, by the way. He's brutal and he fits the Game of Thrones universe perfectly. And I like the setup for the final fight with him quite a bit. The king finally decides to send help, so Damien undergoes a last-ditch effort to win before he gets there out of pride. That's a great setup for Damien. And I think it's a shame, because the way the fight unfolds is really dumb. And Damien's risky fake surrender plan doesn't actually offer his side much advantage in the fight. I mean, Damien should have been killed in this scene like 20 times. He is given an insane amount of plot armor, and his fake surrender doesn't really achieve anything that couldn't have been done by simply charging at the enemy with his whole army. I also think it's kind of ridiculous that they don't know that his entire army was sitting on the other side of that hill so close to them. This might be better if he did the fake surrender so that his dragon could swoop in and light them all on fire, but even then, I wish he would have beat them with a plan that's more tactical than this. After this victory, I think it's kinda odd they keep making the stepstones a big problem over and over again. Why not just have Damien win a war somewhere else, or show that other places are starting to give the kingdom trouble too, making it feel more like Viserys is starting to get overwhelmed, rather than making him look so incompetent that he keeps losing his hold over this one place. And something else that just blows my mind is that Sir Kristen literally beats a man to death at Rhaenyra's wedding, and he faces absolutely zero consequences for it. If there's an explanation of why he gets away with publicly killing someone for no reason, like maybe the queen defends him or something, the show does not give it to you. The second time he kills someone on the council meeting, it makes sense that he gets away with it, because the death serves the interests of the Hightowers, and of course I'm not going to call him out on it. But here at the wedding, it serves no one's interests, he's just a psycho. Another scene I don't like is when Alicent misinterprets her dying husband's last words, which changes her mind about letting Rhaenyra inherit the throne. It really undermines how great a moment it is when the family's all finally getting along and her and Rhaenyra seem to make peace for the sake of Viserys. I think the writers decided to make her changing her mind an accidental misunderstanding in order to make her seem like less of a villain, but it feels really dumb that she truly believes that Viserys is changing the line of succession right after all he just put himself through to defend Rhaenyra and her children's claims. And I think it's not really necessary for Alicent to change her mind, because it's revealed moments later that Otto and the council members were going to install Aegon regardless, so you could just have her be gaslit into supporting the scheme by her father. If the goal of this misunderstanding was to keep her somewhat relatable and likable, this would do it just as well. This plot point just seems really convoluted and forced, and when this lines up with Rhaenys not killing everyone at the coronation because she wants to stay out of the conflict, just to immediately support Rhaenyra in the war right after, and then with Aemon losing control of his dragon accidentally killing Luke, the plot starts to become driven mostly by coincidences, which feels pretty lazy. The whole war could be over before it even starts if Rhaenys simply kills the Hightowers when they were defenseless, but she just doesn't. And then the war still might not happen because Rhaenyra is on the fence about making peace until Aemon happens to lose control of his dragon and kill Luke. I just don't see why they couldn't just tweak these scenes a little bit to make the conflict feel more natural. What makes this plot interesting is the hatred and infighting of the Targaryens. The story would be so much more compelling if Aemon intentionally killed Luke, or at the very least if you had shown more of the relationships the writers have with their dragons before this. Other than a line or two earlier in the show saying that they don't really have full control over the dragons, we've had no indication that they don't listen to their writers, because every scene we've seen them in, they've done exactly as they've been told to. One even burns his owner alive when she commands it, even though it clearly doesn't want to. As it is in the show, Vhagar killing Luke isn't awful, but when it's like the third accidental thing that escalates the conflict in a row, the stakes of the show start to feel somewhat artificial. With that said, I do really like the way the dragon chase scene is done, and they put some really beautiful shots into the sequence. Other than the family dinner scene, I'd say it's definitely the most memorable moment from the entire show. The last comparison I'll make is that the dialogue is simply a lot better in Game of Thrones also. While the conversations aren't dumb in House of the Dragon, they never hit the greatness of the banter between characters like Littlefinger and Varys, or Ned Stark and Jaime Lannister. When I was rewatching the season, there were a lot of conversations that made me just stop and think about what they were saying. Scenes such as Ned and Varys talking about their duties to the realm, or Robert and Cersei talking about why their marriage failed, is able to reveal so much about the characters in a really efficient and natural way. And though House of the Dragon does have a lot of well-written exchanges, particularly from Otto, Alicent, and Damien, it doesn't quite reach the heights of its predecessor. And with that said, I'm done bullying this show, okay? I do enjoy House of the Dragon, and if it wasn't attached to the name Game of Thrones, it would get a lot less criticism from me because it wouldn't have that standard looming over it. Game of Thrones just has a big advantage in that it's set up with multiple storylines, so if you don't like the Dothraki stuff, it's not a big deal because you're probably attracted to a different character on the show. But with House of the Dragon, if you're not invested in this family drama, there's just nothing here for you. And I think it really suffers by not having a moral compass anchor kind of character in the middle of this. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention about the characters earlier is that the Valerians are a pretty interesting group of people in this show. I do like the storyline of them constantly chasing power, and it's basically leading to the destruction of their house. And by the time they realize that, it's too late. Even though it doesn't live up to the first show yet, the way the season ended makes me hopeful for Season 2. And now that all the backstory has been established, it finally gets to use the main advantage that it has over Game of Thrones, which is the main plot being an all-out dragon war. It would be harder to make that not entertaining than it would be to make it good. I also really hope that the children get more development in order to make the family feud more interesting, because that's something really lacking for me at the moment. It's not there yet, but I truly think that this show does have the potential to get onto the level of Game of Thrones eventually. Also, I didn't read the books that either of these shows are based on, but for anyone that has, if there's something I said I wanted to change about the plot that kind of can't change because it's going to lead to something later, let me know in the comments. I'm interested to see. I think that's all I really have to say about House of the Dragon until the show comes back, but giving it a rewatch has kind of made me get back into Game of Thrones. After it ended so badly, I kind of wrote it off for a while, but if you guys want to see more episodes about it, I have no shortage of things I would love to dig into with that show. I mean, I think Tywin Lannister is probably one of my favorite villains of all time. I love what they do with Jon Snow for most of the show. Daenerys becomes really great. Tyrion is amazing. And I could talk about that stuff all day. But that's going to do it for this one. If you like the video, like the video. Subscribe for more, and I'll see y'all in the next episode of HeadCannon.